People are saying 5 countries banned Netanyahu's plane and that the global order is collapsing in real time. And I get why that goes viral. Because it's a perfect story. A leader so isolated that even the sky is closing around him. But before you accept that as fact, we need to do the one thing the algorithm hates. Slow down and separate what's verifiable from what's performative. Because the truth is, airspace isn't banned the way a nightclub bans someone. It's permissions, corridors, legal exposure, diplomatic clearances, emergency landing risk, and, right now more than ever, politics. So if you want to understand what's actually happening, I'll give you a clear framework in plain English, and by the end you'll know why plain banned headlines are usually the surface layer of something deeper. Here's the mini payoff early. Even if multiple countries refused overflight or made it politically risky, the bigger story isn't 5 countries. The bigger story is that the world is splitting into zones where legal obligations, security risks, and political alliances are colliding. So the same flight becomes routine in one corridor and radioactive in another. That's not just about Netanyahu. That's about the direction the world is moving. Now let's start with what we can actually verify. In recent years, flight tracking and reporting have shown Netanyahu's official aircraft, the Wing of Zion, taking unusual routes to avoid large stretches of European airspace, often described as linked to concerns around an international criminal court warrant and the risk of a forced landing in a country that might feel obligated to act. That pattern has been reported by outlets including The Guardian, Le Monde, ABC News, and Israel's own press, TheGuardian.com. That alone matters because it tells you something simple. The route itself has become political. But the viral claim you're seeing now, 5 countries banned his plane, is usually missing the most important detail. Were these countries actually refusing overflight permission in a documented way, or was the flight path designed to avoid them because the risk was too high? Those are not the same. A refusal is a formal diplomatic act. Avoidance is a strategic choice to reduce exposure, legal exposure, political exposure, security exposure. And the internet loves to blur those two because banned is a stronger word than avoided. Now let's explain how this actually works. Because once you understand the mechanics, you'll stop getting emotionally hijacked by these headlines. When a head of government travels, their aircraft doesn't just fly like a commercial plane. It typically requires overflight permissions and diplomatic clearances, especially for state aircraft. Sometimes those clearances are routine. Sometimes they're political. And here's the crucial part people miss. It's not just about whether a country allows you to pass over its territory. It's also about what happens if something goes wrong. Because if there's an emergency landing, mechanical issue, medical issue, fuel issue, then suddenly you're not just over airspace. You're on the ground, inside a jurisdiction, under local law. That's why you saw reporting about Netanyahu taking long detours that avoid countries where an arrest warrant could create legal peril if he had to land unexpectedly. The Guardian. That's the hidden driver, emergency landing risk. And if you're thinking, okay, but is that really that serious? Yes, because the entire controversy is rooted in the ICC arrest warrant issue and the obligations of Rome Statute members. Whether those obligations would be enforced in practice is political, but the risk exists, and flight planning is about reducing tail risk. The Guardian. Now let's tackle the 5 countries part honestly. I cannot verify from the public reporting I'm seeing a single definitive list that says these exact 5 countries formally banned Netanyahu's plane in the immediate present. What I can verify is something more important and more consistent with how this story usually happens. There are countries whose governments have publicly taken strong stances on the ICC process or on Israel's war policy, and reporting has described Netanyahu's flights avoiding certain airspaces, including Spain in some reports, and avoiding large stretches of Europe in general. The Indian Express. So the smarter way to think about it is this. Some airspaces are avoided because they're politically hostile. Some are avoided because they're legally risky. Some are avoided because they're operationally closed or restricted during conflict escalations. And right now, especially with Middle East airspace disruptions and closures being reported broadly, even normal routes can be blocked for plain security reasons. appnews.com. That's why the world feels like it's collapsing in real time. Because on the ground and in the air, normal movement is being replaced by corridors, exceptions, and risk management. Now here's where the story gets bigger than Netanyahu. Because the headline isn't really about a plane, it's about the global order, the rules, the institutions, and whether they apply equally to powerful people. If you've watched the ICC debate, you know it's not just a legal argument, it's a legitimacy argument. One side says international law must apply to everyone, or it's meaningless. The other side says the ICC is politicized, and sovereign leaders are protected. And when a leader's plane changes course to avoid jurisdictions that might enforce a warrant, it becomes a symbol of that conflict. Not because anyone fired a missile, because the sky itself becomes a map of legitimacy. Now let's talk about why the ban framing is such a powerful weapon. Because if you can make people believe 5 countries banned his plane, you can make people believe he's isolated, he's vulnerable, his allies are breaking, the world is turning against him. And that may be partially true in political terms, but plane ban is still a distortion if it's really route avoidance, airspace closures, or uncertain legal exposure. This is why misinformation thrives in geopolitics. Not because everything is fake, because tiny wording choices change the emotional meaning of the same event. Now let me give you the simplest filter that works every time. When you see X countries ban the plane, ask, was there an official statement? Was there a published NOTAM or aviation restriction that explicitly applies to that aircraft? Did major outlets name the specific countries and confirm the refusal? Or are we just looking at a flight path and guessing the motive? Because flight paths can show you what was avoided, but they don't always prove why. And in at least one past case, reporting described how France had allowed overflight, but the plane still avoided French airspace anyway, showing how the flight planners might choose avoidance even when permission exists. Le Monde FR. That is a crucial detail. It means the absence of overflight isn't always a ban. Sometimes it's strategy. Now, why would a country actually deny overflight? There are a few reasons, and none of them require the world to be collapsing. 1. Legal and political risk. A country may not want to be seen facilitating travel for someone under an ICC warrant, even if it never intends to arrest them. 2. Domestic politics. Leaders don't just manage foreign policy, they manage voters. A controversial overflight can create internal backlash. 3. Security and safety. In periods of heightened military tension, airspace restrictions can be implemented for safety, and they can hit everyone, not just one leader. 4. Leverage. Sometimes countries use permissions as bargaining chips, so yes, it's possible multiple countries could deny or delay overflight permissions. But the jump to global order collapsing depends on what you mean by collapsing. If you mean the old assumption that everything is normal and frictionless, that's already gone. If you mean international systems no longer function, that's not proven by one flight. Now, let's address the 77-year global order style of rhetoric that always shows up in these stories. The global order doesn't collapse like a building implodes. It erodes. It becomes selective. It becomes fragmented. It becomes less universal and more tribal. And travel corridors are one of the first places you see it, because borders and airspace are real. They're enforceable. They're visible. So when a leader has to route around certain countries, it's not just a travel story. It's a map of where authority still feels unified and where it doesn't. Now here's the part people don't want to hear because it removes the drama. Even if 5 countries refused overflight, that does not automatically mean everyone is turning on Israel, or NATO is breaking, or the West is collapsing. It can mean the legal risk is real enough that multiple governments don't want to touch it, and that in itself is significant, because it signals a shift. The space between political support and legal exposure is widening. Countries can support Israel politically while still fearing the domestic and legal costs of being seen as enabling a specific leader's movement. That tension is the real story. Now, the reason this feels like it's happening in real time is because the internet is giving you the illusion of immediate certainty. A flight path appears on a tracker. Someone slaps a caption on it. Millions see it before any government clarifies anything. And by the time the nuance shows up, the emotional narrative has already won. So if you want to be smarter than the feed, do this. Treat airspace stories like you treat markets. The first story is loud, the real story arrives slower, and the truth is usually in the incentives. Now let's tie this to a real pattern you can verify. When Netanyahu's plane took unusual detours previously, multiple outlets connected it to ICC arrest risk and the desire to avoid many European airspaces, with flight tracking supporting the route change. The Guardian. That's not just gossip. That's a documented pattern. Politics and legal risk shaping the route. So whether the number is 5 or not, the larger reality is still serious. International legal pressure is now strong enough that it can shape the movement of heads of government, even if indirectly. That is not collapse, but it is a transformation. Now here are 3 watch next signals that will tell you if this becomes bigger than one headline. First, do more governments publicly clarify their stance on overflight permissions in relation to ICC warrants? When governments start speaking openly about this, it means the issue has moved from quiet bureaucracy into loud politics. Second, do other leaders start changing routes as well? If this becomes common, it signals a broader fragmentation of travel norms for sanctioned or legally exposed figures. Third, do we see formal policy changes? For example, explicit government guidance on overflight permissions or parliamentary pressure forcing clarity. Because when policies become formal, the order isn't collapsing, it's changing shape. Now, I want to give you one clean conclusion that you can repeat without spreading misinformation. The claim that 5 countries banned Netanyahu's plane may be an oversimplification unless we see named, confirmed refusals. But the underlying pattern is real. Netanyahu's flights have taken unusual routes that avoid large portions of European airspace, widely reported as linked to concerns about legal exposure and ICC-related risk. And the broader environment of airspace disruption makes routes even more politically and operationally sensitive. The Guardian. That's the truth behind the headline. And it tells you something deeper than a plain story. The world is entering an era where movement, law, security, and legitimacy are colliding, and the sky is becoming one of the first places you can see it. Now I want your take. Do you think these airspace and legal pressure stories are mostly symbolic, political theater that doesn't change much on the ground? Or do you think they're the early signs of a real fragmentation where international law and alliances stop being universal and start becoming selective corridors? Drop your answer.